So, hi David, welcome
Hello.
to our television. We have
Thank
some
you.
questions for you. The first question is, how much can people change their life and destiny, and how much is it predestined from birth? Can people really change anything in their life? That's the first question.
Well, I think we can change everything. I think one of the great ways that people are controlled is being persuaded that they have no power. They have no power to influence their own life often, but certainly the world in general. For me, we are creating our reality from our perceptions, second by second, minute by minute. Our perceptions represent a frequency. It can be a low frequency, it can be a high frequency, it can be a narrow frequency, it can be an expanded frequency. And I suggest, and I write about this in the books at length, we live in the equivalent of a quantum computer universe, where all around us is a sea of information, a sea of possibility and probability. And we are taking from that library, that mass of possibility and probability, that outcome, that manifestation, that experience that relates to our perceptions and the frequency of our perceptions. So if you, for instance, have a self-perception that you are powerless, that you have no power, that you have no potential, that you are at the mercy of events, then your sense of the possible is very, very narrow. And so you will interact with the fields of possibility and probability within that narrow band. And you will then bring that into manifestation in your life as what we call experience. And that experience will mirror your perception. So you will live a life which is limited, in which you seem to be a victim of circumstance, a victim of other people. And that will then confirm to you the original perception that you have no power and that you're at the mercy of events. So it becomes a feedback loop. Your perception creates your reality, and then your reality confirms to you that your perception was right in the first place, because your reality is mirroring your perception. We can at any time break that feedback loop, break that that circuit by changing our perceptions. If you look at the way people are controlled en masse, it's by controlling their perceptions. This is why you have a media that's owned by this network of manipulation, and the sources of information that people receive are owned and controlled by this network of manipulation. It's because if you control information that people receive, you control their perceptions, because people come to their perceptions from the information they receive. And we can break this cycle anytime we want by changing our perception. Very simple example. Someone who has a perception that the glass is always half empty will have a very different life experience to someone who believes it's always half full. You can take a football example. You have two football teams playing. One is playing terribly, and they're 2-0 down. They can't kick the ball in the right direction to save their lives. And then somehow, through apparently a lucky break, they score a goal. Against everything, all the run of play, they score a goal. What invariably happens then? The team that was shocking and losing 2-0 and was going nowhere, suddenly starts to come into the game. They start to play better. They start to show confidence, more confidence in the game, and the game can transform. Now, the skill of the team that was 2-0 down hasn't changed. They're no more skillful suddenly out of nowhere than they were before. No better footballers than they were a few minutes ago. What has changed is their perception. And what has changed that perception is just getting that lucky goal. It's changed their attitude. It's changed the way they look at the game and themselves. Hey, hold on a minute. We've got a chance here. And you see this in life all the time, where people's perceptions of self, their own sense of possibility, their own potential, is mirrored in the lives that they live. So the key is perceptions. The manipulating networks want control of our perceptions. We need to take that control back, because everything changes then.
Okay, thank you. The second question, do you have a vision? When will the world change? I just translated the questions how they were written. So when will the world change? I think for the better, they think. If you know when, or... Well,
I don't think we're looking at anything that's going to happen like that in an instant. The world is changing.
Yeah.
The world is changing in front of our eyes. You see, I've been doing the work that I do now for nearly 30 years, writing the books, doing the talks, doing the research all over the world. And when I started out, no one wanted to listen. I lived my life to the sound of laughter and ridicule and dismissal. And then as the years have gone on and gone on and gone on, I've seen this vast transformation in the number of people who are now looking at the world through different eyes, from a different angle, and they're starting to question things that they never would have questioned before. I mean, this recent shooting, for instance, in Las Vegas, the number of people who have rejected the official story is enormous compared with what it would have been 10, 20, 30 years ago. People are questioning events, and they're questioning reality more than they ever have before. And it's an ongoing process. And what I'm seeing around the world now is not just the number of people increasing, but the kind of people. The people who were system people, who you thought would never question anything. They just take the system's version of everything and repeat it, and accept it as reality. Well, more and more of those people are not doing that anymore. So the world is changing. It's dramatically changing compared with where my compass, which is what it was like 30 years ago and 20 years ago. We are seeing an awakening, but I think a lot of people have this vision of suddenly some cloud coming down, and suddenly people awaken and it's all over. This is not what is happening. This is a process. I wrote a book in the first book I wrote on these subjects in 1990 called Truth Vibrations. And I called it Truth Vibrations because I was told through several psychics in those days, in 1990, that there was a vibrational change coming that was going to wake people up from their slumber. And it was going to have two main impacts. One, people were going to awaken from the sleep, and that the people most awake would be affected first, and then eventually the people really asleep at that time would start to be affected. And the other impact I was told it would have is that all that had been hidden from us was going to be brought to the surface where it can be seen. And at that time in 1990, there seemed to be there was no evidence of that whatsoever. But as these decades have unfolded, I've seen it happen. more and more people, like I say, are looking at the world differently, looking at themselves differently, questioning reality, questioning events. And when you look now, and anyone that's kind of newish to this information about the global hidden hand manipulating events and dictating the direction of the world, they might not realize that 30 years ago, this information was not circulating anything like it is now, not even fractionally. There was just a few of us. We never had the internet. You were communicating information in books, self-published books. You were doing it through printed leaflets. There wasn't the internet that we have today, anything like the scale that we have now. So there has been a tremendous a change in the way, the numbers of people who are seeing this. And we shouldn't underestimate how far we've come. It's easy, and I understand it, to look at the world and you see events moving on, and you think, well, we're not getting anywhere. But if they'd have been on my shoulder for the last 3 decades, they realize we are really getting somewhere compared with then, and it's going to go on. And see what we're seeing now. And it's bad in one way and confirmation in another, is we are seeing more and more efforts to stop this information circulating because of the effect it's having on the number of people who are looking at the world differently. So now you have, for instance, Google, YouTube, owned by Google, Facebook, and these internet giants that all in the end are controlled by the same people, that are now openly telling you that they're using algorithms to suppress information that challenges the official story of everything. They're using the excuse of fake news, they're using the excuse of hate speech, they're using the excuse of terrorism, but they're just excuses to actually suppress and undermine the independent media that's grown up in the internet age and has been the vehicle for pointing out to people that actually the official story of everything is not to be accepted without question, far from it. And actually, I've mentioned the Las Vegas shooting. That is a very, very good example of what I'm talking about, because I've researched these mass shootings and terrorist attacks for a long, long time now, one after the other. The official story of what happened checks out, and invariably, almost every time, it doesn't. But in all that time, I have rarely come across any one of them that has unraveled and fallen apart as quickly and as comprehensively and as blatantly as the Las Vegas shooting story. We've now reached the point this very week where mainstream news presenters, like people like Tucker Carlson on Fox News in America, are actually looking at the official story of the Las Vegas shooting and with incredulity, because they keep changing the story. Time and time again, it's changed 3 times so far. And so when you start to get mainstream people start to look at these things and say, well, hold on a minute, this doesn't make sense. All they're doing is what people like me and many others have been doing for all these years, which is saying, okay, this is the official story of what's happened here. Let's see if it is true. Let's see if it makes sense. And this process is now being done by more and more and more people all over the world. And they're starting to see the stunning scale on which they've been lied to all their lives. So this is the way the awakening is moving and expanding. And it's never as as big as we'd like it to be, but it is massive now compared with what it was when I started out.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. It's how is it possible to stop the Islamization of the United Kingdom, France, etc., or it's too late as so many people in these countries are brainwashed? This is the question from our viewer from UK. So about that topic.
Well, this is a massive question with enormous numbers of dots to connect. And I've got a new book coming out in the middle of this coming November, next month, called Everything You Need to Know But Have Never Been Told, in which I do go into this subject and many others at length and in considerable detail. What is happening is the hidden hand wants to, I mean, it goes deeper than this. It's to do with racial types that they want to suppress and many other things. But on the simplest level, it's to create a divide and rule by bringing in large numbers of people from other cultures and causing conflict by the sheer numbers with the indigenous population. Because when there's a few of you and you want to control the many, you have to set the many at war with themselves. You know, this is not about suppressing the white race and not suppressing the Muslim faith. This is about suppressing everybody. But to bring that about, they need the target population in all its various racial and religious forms to be at war with each other. Because as long as that's going on, people are so focused on fighting each other, they don't realize that they're all being controlled by the same force. And the same force sits there in the shadows laughing its head off. And so this process of not just, I mean, you know, when you have wars created in the Middle East by the West, by the United States overwhelmingly, but Britain big time. I mean, that's the demonic duo, that is, the United States and Britain, throw in Germany and France as well in terms of the people that run those countries.
Yeah.
Then when people are made homeless and become refugees because of those wars of conquest by the Western powers, then of course we should be helping those people as best we can. Where necessary, we should be taking those refugees in because it's the humane thing to do. However, this is the cover story for what's really happening. When you look at the numbers of migrants coming in from the Middle East and Africa and elsewhere, they are not, overwhelmingly they are not, refugees fleeing war who deserve help. They are overwhelmingly adult young men who are coming in as economic migrants, not fleeing war. And this, of course, when you introduce large numbers of young adult men into from one culture into another, you're going to have problems. And that's what we've seen in Germany, even more so in places like Sweden. And Sweden's a good example in the sense that I went to that country several times, many, many years ago. And I went back there in the spring, summer of this year. And Sweden is not the same country. It's nothing like the same country as it was because of all the problems and pressures and upheavals that have been caused by, in Sweden's case, absolutely massive unchecked immigration of other cultures. And if you look at what's happening in Sweden, where there are no-go areas increasing all the time for the police, there are no-go areas for the general population. You don't go there because it's too dangerous. Then you are seeing in Sweden the very fault lines of divide and rule and conflict that this is really all about. And when you look at so many of these areas of upheaval, including this one, if you chart it back and chart it back, you invariably end up with the same name, George Soros. George Soros is a multi-billionaire Rothschild frontman who uses the money that the hidden hand ensures that he gets in massive amounts to fund this manipulation. And so you have his network of foundations called the Open Society Foundations and other connected organizations, which are provably working to open the doors of Europe to as many migrants from other cultures as possible, not on the basis of need, but on the basis of what this agenda wants to happen. And George Soros, this very week, it's been announced, has just transferred $18 billion to this Open Society global network. So you can see that that's not, being done out of, the goodness of his heart. It's being done to systematically increase massively the funding of this network of manipulation, which is absolutely at the heart, the center of this open door policy into Europe. And people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, where, of course, Soros comes from, is openly and rightly now saying that this is what Soros is doing. And he is. And so often, people focus on the politicians who are officially introducing policies and changes, but it's the wrong focus. The politicians are just the puppets. It's people like Soros we should be focusing on, because that's where it's coming from, and the people that control him. And this whole migrant crisis has not happened naturally. It's not happened organically. It's happened by design. And it's been planned a very, very, very long time. I quote a man in my last book, Phantom Self, called Dr. Richard Day. Dr. Richard Day was a Rockefeller family insider. He was an executive of a Rockefeller organization called Planned Parenthood, which started out in the eugenics movement. And he knew what the agenda was, and no one knows why. But in 1969, he addressed a meeting of pediatricians in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And he asked people to not take notes and to put down, to turn off recording equipment, because he was going to tell them how the world was going to change, because those that he was connected to were going to change it in this way. And he started to list a long, long list, which I detail in the last book, of changes that were coming, that they were going to impose. And they have happened or are happening in enormous detail. I mean, it's extraordinary what he said in 1969 against what has happened and is happening. And one of the things he said was that they were going to have mass immigration, mass migration into of one culture into another, because he said countries and people are much easier to change when they is a large number of people who are not part of that culture. In other words, if you have a culture that is very identifiable and has a long, long history in that place, then people are very, very much more unwilling to change, because this history, this culture is ingrained in them. They don't want to change it. And the idea, he was saying, basically, was that you then introduce a massive number of people from another culture, and you dilute the indigenous culture. And in diluting the indigenous culture and its sense of identity, you dilute the resistance of people in that country to changing in the way that you want it to change. And all the things that he said, including that, are happening. And we need to understand that. It's not about racism. It's because both the indigenous population and the migrant population are both being manipulated by the same string pullers. It's about seeing things for what they are and why they're really happening. Because otherwise, as the questioner mentioned, if people don't realize why it's happening, they don't challenge the fact that it is happening.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. The next question is, do you think it's possible for Czech Republic to get the Czechsit like yours, Brexit? And do you see, and if you see the Brexit as a good step for your country or good solution to some problems?
Well, I think Brexit is a wonderful thing to have happened. It shocked the establishment in this country. They had no idea that the referendum vote was going to go that way, because they don't listen to people. And the people they've ignored year after year, decade after decade, came back to bite them in the referendum. The political classes in Britain, from left across to right, they all thought that if they frightened the public into believing that the world would end if we voted for Brexit, then that's all they needed to do, because, you know, the great unwashed will just do what we say. Well, the great unwashed did not, and it shocked them. And what we're seeing now is, both in Britain and in Brussels, a concerted campaign to stop Brexit happening. We're having various official organizations, all connected and controlled by the same network, coming out and saying it's going to be terrible, it's going to be catastrophe, and you know, you don't have to leave. We can have another referendum and vote to stay in, which is what, of course, they've done before when countries have voted in referendums in ways that the bureaucratic hierarchy in Brussels didn't want. They just had another referendum and got the result they wanted. So this is what's going on. And the reason there's such an attempt to stop Brexit happening is because, as I've said in the books for 30 years now nearly, the whole plan is to centralize power in every area of our lives. Simple reason: the more you centralize power, the more power you have at the center to centralize even quicker, so that the speed of centralization gets faster and faster, is what we've seen. And the more power you get at the center, the more power you give a tiny few over the very many, which is what this is all about. This is what globalization is all about. It's what these big trade agreements are all about. And so the idea of the European Union, from the start, when it was still the common market, was to envelop and absorb the entirety of Europe and eventually what is Eastern Europe, and to centrally dictate to all those countries and communities from a bureaucratic center, with a single currency and a European central bank and total control of everything. So the idea of the European Union is to absorb more and more countries, not to let anyone go. And this is why they're trying as hard as they can to stop this Brexit happening. Now, of course, anyone can vote for Brexit if they can secure a referendum in their own country. But in most countries, that is very, very difficult because the political parties of all different persuasions are welded to the whole European Union idea. And, you know, when you break it down, it's extraordinary, really. When we were having this Brexit debate in Britain, and these various parties, the Greens, the left, the right, the centre, were all saying, you know, Europe, it's European, EU, it's about bringing people together and all that, and it's about democracy. I love it, democracy. And people were saying to them, sometimes in television interviews, okay, so name the presidents of the EU. Name them. Name the people that run this and run that and run that. Name them. None of them could. And we have this inversion in the way the EU is sold, in the sense that it is a centralized bureaucratic dictatorship and tyranny in which the great majority of laws imposed on the countries of the EU don't come from within the countries themselves, but from the bureaucrats in Brussels, the very opposite of democracy. We're having that sold as a democratic organization. They only have a European Parliament, which has no power, basically, so that they can say, look, it's a democracy. The European Union is a democracy. Look, we have a parliament. When all the decisions are made by bureaucrats in Brussels. So people are so programmed by this European Union cover story, the propaganda, that they can't see they're living in a tyranny where the few are dictating to the many systematically through the laws of the European Union. And so many of the parties, like I say, in the various countries have bought this nonsense that without the European Union, everything would fall apart, that it's very, very difficult to get a referendum. We got a referendum in Britain for one reason. The person, we had a party, we still have a party that's not as big as it was, but we have a party here called UKIP, the United Kingdom Party, Independence Party. And it was created purely to get us out of the EU, basically. And it was very successful in that. And it started to get votes from the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. And the Conservative Party started to get worried, and it was under a leader called David Cameron. And they were worried that at the upcoming election at the time, that they were going to lose a lot of votes to this UKIP party from people who wanted to get out of the EU. So what then happened is Cameron said, if I'm voted back to power or into power, I will have a referendum on whether we stay in Europe or not. Now, he still didn't believe that it would happen because up to that point, he'd been in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats Party, a centre party that is absolutely obsessed with the EU. And the opinion polls suggested that after that election, the same thing would happen. And he knew that the coalition party with the Liberal Democrats would never allow him to have a referendum, even though he'd promised it, to come in and out of the EU. What then happened is they had the election, and Cameron's Conservative Party won the election outright against the odds, which left him in an untenable position. He'd promised the referendum, which he never thought would happen, and he's now got the power, no coalition party to stop him, to introduce the referendum, and he can't find a way of not having it. So they then have the referendum, and they think, oh, like I say, oh, we'll just frighten them to death, and they'll vote the way we want. And they didn't. That's how we got our referendum. Not because any of the parties in Britain wanted us to have it, but it was just a sequence of events that led there. So it's very difficult to get a referendum in the countries of Europe because of this process.
But if you think it's possible for other countries to leave the European Union because the United Kingdom is such strong in economics, and I think that the Britain is the voice of economics here in EU. So if you think that the small country like ours country or maybe Hungary, Slovakia, if they can really leave an European Union without any problems, if you think it's possible.
Well, not without any problems, because when you get yourself so utterly tied up and controlled by a bureaucracy in Brussels, then obviously there is a process which is not easy of untangling yourself from that. But let's look at it the other way. Look at the countries that are not in the European Union. Are they any worse off, often better off, outside the European Union? Because what has happened, and I wrote about this years and years ago, and Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, Slovakia as now, is a classic example. And I've just done a lot of talks earlier this year through the Balkans and seeing the same thing. You've had these countries of Europe who over centuries have been under the dictatorship of the Romans, under the dictatorship of various empires, under the dictatorship of the Habsburg Empire, and then under the dictatorship of the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union started to broke up, you had this period of independence where countries were ruling themselves from within their borders. After all these decades, centuries of control and dictatorship, they were making their own decisions within their own borders. Look at how short that was.
Yeah.
Come to 2004, and that around that period, they're going into the European Union, which is just a centralized dictatorship. They're going into NATO, which is the same on the military area. What is going on? After all these centuries, these countries got independence and then handed it away without a gun being fired to these dark suit bureaucrats in Brussels. It's extraordinary. And it's not by accident. The Soviet Union served a purpose in creating fear and conflict and division between West and East, which allowed massive stockpiling of nuclear weapons, for instance, that would never have been justified without that Cold War. But as I wrote at the time, this conspiracy to transform human society has a timeline which it's trying to stick to. And the time was reached when the plan envisaged the absorbing of the countries of Eastern Europe into NATO and into the European Union. So suddenly this guy Gorbachev turns up, one of the few Soviet leaders who didn't look like he'd just come back from a funeral. And he's smiling, and Margaret Thatcher, the great anti-communist, says, "Oh, I can do business with this man." And suddenly, it breaks up. He's close to the Rockefeller family, Gorbachev. It breaks up. The wall comes down, and then you have this brief period where these countries are independent. Yes, at last. But then they hand over their independence to bureaucrats in Brussels and bureaucrats at NATO, also in Brussels, NATO. And so it's very sad, I think, And those countries could have functioned outside of the European Union. They can function outside the European Union. The difference is they were functioning outside the European Union. Now they have a whole bureaucracy to disconnect from, so that they can go back to how they were in that brief period I'm talking about. It's very, very sad. And then you look at the fact that all these different countries, and it's happening in the Balkans, they're trying to manipulate the same in places like Serbia now. You look at these various governments in these various former Soviet, former Yugoslavian states, and they all are pushing and have pushed to go into the European Union and NATO. Do you mean there's no one that gets into power and says this is a bad idea? It's all coordinated. Yeah. You know, people get into power in politics because they have money and they have exposure. They have a media that is basically sympathetic to them. And if you've got that those benefits, then there's a very, very good chance that you're going to get elected to power. And those that get elected to power invariably are, whether they realize it or not, some do, some don't, serving this hidden hand in its agenda, which includes the absorption of all the countries of Eastern Europe into NATO and into the European Union. And that's what we've been seeing.
Yeah, I always say that the Soviet Union was a scarecrow where the people here now are saying, I hate communists, so hooray, democracy, and now we are enslaved as the same as the West world, and we are not better.
No, exactly. Funnily enough, you know, in some of my earlier books, I quoted Soviet dissidents who came out of the Soviet Union into Western Europe, who, as the European Union unfolded, they were saying, hold on a minute, this is communism. This is what we've just escaped from. And because they have this European Parliament, see, we're a democracy, they think they can hide the fact that we're looking at a communist, fascist, I mean, the same thing, really, in terms of the people and everything. A communist, fascist dictatorship is emerging in Europe called democracy. It's if it wasn't so tragic, it would be hilarious, the way that people have been scammed into believing that the European Union is some way different to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was far more in your face, maybe, but the same control is possible in another way, and that's what's happening with the European Union. And I say this to people. If you don't like what the European Union is now, well, stick around, because this is not where it's meant to stop. This centralization of power and centralization of control is meant to go on and on and on and on. I was writing decades ago about the plan for a European army, the plan for a European police force. Now they're announcing it. This is what they want. It's all been planned all along. And where we are now is not where it's meant to be. And, you know, when I've looked at the Croatias and I've looked at these other countries who've gone into the European Union after they've seen what it was, and especially after the Euro crisis, etc. And I've said it's like going into the European Union now and then is like looking at a tower block of apartments on fire and asking when you can move in. It's crazy, man. But propaganda is very powerful.
Yeah, that's true. The next question is from Czech Infowars. What's the role of President Trump?
Well, I've been consistent on this all along, really. I say Trump is there because he's meant to be there, at least in the short term. Because you look at, it comes back to what I was saying earlier. You look at the way people are now questioning what they wouldn't question before, how they're becoming more and more skeptical and wary of government and what it's doing. And in the United States is a very, very large number of people who are in that state of perception, of observing the world. If you're going to tap into that and manipulate it, you need someone standing for president who's going to tell that group of people what they want to hear. This is how people get into parliament. This is how they get into power. They tell people what they want to hear during the election campaign, and then they get in and do what they were always going to do all along, which is not what the people wanted to hear. So you sit round a table and you say, what is my natural constituency? What is the area of this society that is most likely to vote for me? And you look at the diehard Republicans. Well, they're going to vote for Trump anyway, because the last thing they'll ever do is vote Democrat. What's going to tip the balance here? What's going to tip the balance is if we can get this great area of, if you like, patriotic America, conspiracy awareness people, people who are very distrustful of government, all these people. We need to get them. So what do? Trump comes out and he starts telling people what they want to hear. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do the other. And then he gets in power and does what was going to happen all along. We had a guy who told us he was going to drain the swamp. Well, he's been swimming in it all his life, so it's a very unlikely he's going to drain it. But he has the absolute nerve to castigate Hillary Clinton, who is absolutely appalling. What a choice, Trump or Clinton. He castigates Clinton for her closeness to Goldman Sachs and all this stuff. And one of his first things in power is to hand the United States Treasury and its economy, in effect, to Goldman Sachs as Treasury Secretary and as head of the Economic Council. He then tells this that one of the things that this constituency that he was targeting, or people were targeting through him, wanted to hear, is an end to the American wars of acquisition in the Middle East and around the world. No more foreign wars, no more foreign escapades using the American military. And he said that's what he wanted to do. He said he wanted to get closer to Russia, which again, people want to hear, people who have a brain anyway, because we don't want massive conflict in the world. We want people talking to each other. And then he gets into power, and what's changed in terms of what's happened in the Middle East? I mean, he's put a guy in the Pentagon called Mad Dog Mattis. I mean, it's not giving it away, is he? The man's a psychopath. And he's controlling the American military, and they're carrying on as usual. I said that he would target Iran and he would target China. Exactly what's happened. Why? Because in the year 2000, there was a list produced by a group called the Project for the New American Century, who are known as neocons. They controlled the Bush administration. From the background, they controlled many of the policies of the Obama administration. And they listed a series of countries they wanted to regime change in September 2000. They were countries like Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, China, Lebanon, etc. And so when you look at the regime of Bush, he started to tick off this list thanks to the manufactured attack in 9/11. He picks off, first of all, Afghanistan, and then he picks off Iraq based on a lie. That's off the list. He then hands over to Obama. Obama picks off Libya and starts with Syria. And then in comes Trump, and he starts to target Iran on the list. He starts to target China on the list, and he starts to target North Korea on the list.
Yeah.
So as these apparently different presidents in different parties with different policies come into power, they actually just continue the same agenda because they're all puppets for this hidden hand. And so now you look at Trump, and so many people who voted for Trump, believing that he was the guy that was going to really do what they wanted. And they're all, well, not all, some are still clinging on to trying to not face reality. But vast numbers of them are absolutely, totally disillusioned with what Trump has done. Often the opposite of what he said he would do to get elected. So Trump's very much the man that they wanted, I think, at least in the short term. And we'll see how short or long that term will be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There's a lot of other questions. Is there some theories you needed to evaluate, change, or reduce? Something you were wrong and understood that after some time?
I would go the other way and say that what has happened over the years, as it should, is that more and more information comes to light. And you start to see what is most centrally significant and what is merely interesting. It's interesting that this happened, and it's interesting how it was manipulated to happen, but it's peripheral to the main thrust of what's happening. And I've tended to, as the years have progressed, to focus more and more on those things that are central to this global manipulation, as opposed to the things that are part of it, but are more peripheral, they're more interesting rather than central to what's going on. And it's been like layer and layer and layer. You start off and you know it to a certain point, and so you talk about it the only way you can at that point of understanding. And then the layers increase and the layers increase, and you're going deeper and deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole. And it's not that what you say changes in terms of the theme, but you're able to get more detail. You're able to get more a deeper understanding of the scale and depth of what is happening. That's really what's changed, rather than thinking, "Oh, this is not happening," and I thought it was. Yeah. So you get one or two of those things, but they're peripheral. On the main thrust of what's happening, it's just more and more detail that you gather, rather than putting something aside and saying, "No, it's not happening as I thought."
Yeah, there's a follow-up question. Despite everything you know, is there something that really surprised you or shocked you? You know, some information that you just went, "Oh, that's impossible." Is there something that really shocked you?
Well, I've never said that's impossible about something, because that's the reflex action dismissal that means so much information that we should be looking at is just thrown away. So I'll look at something and I'll see if it stands up to scrutiny. And if it does, I'll go with it. If it doesn't, I won't. But in terms of being shocked, well, I've been shocked by many things. I was shocked at the scale of child abuse by the rich and famous. I was shocked at the scale of Satanism and human sacrifice by the rich and famous and these networks. I was shocked at the scale of evil that runs Hollywood, that runs the banking system, that runs global politics, that runs the global media. Of course, you are shocked and taken aback when you realize that what we see in the hidden, or rather in the seen, in the world of the seen, is actually ultimately controlled by entities in the unseen that aren't even human. Of course, that's going to take you aback when you first come across that. But again, when I came across it way back now, I didn't dismiss it. I didn't accept it immediately either, just because someone's told me doesn't mean it's true. And you wait, you put it on the back burner, and you wait for more information, and then more information comes, and more information comes, and more information comes. And there comes a point where the information is there's so much of it, and it's so confirming from different people who have no idea the others exist, that you cross that line where you say, actually, this may seem fantastic, but this is happening. And that's the process that I've gone through with all these things. What I was told about the Satanism and the child abuse, I didn't just say, okay, oh yeah, this is happening. You wait. What you don't do, what you never do, is dismiss it, because without question, without research, you say, hold on, well, this sounds fantastic, but I'm going to look at this and see what if it stands up. And it does, over and over and over again, all over the world. So yes, I've been shocked a number of times, but not shocked in the way that you say, oh, this is impossible, this is ridiculous. Almost everything that we accept today would have seemed ridiculous at the time it was first suggested. I mean, tell a caveman that you can fly into space. Tell a caveman that you can speak to someone on the other side of the world by looking into a little piece of technology. They'd say it was crazy, but it's not. It's possible. It's just not possible at that time because of the level of knowledge and technological knowledge. So people dismiss so much, not because it's not true, but because their mind does not have the capacity to envisage that it could be true. It's like someone said, words to the effect of, don't judge the limitation of possibility by the limitation of your own mind. They're not the same thing.
Okay, we have some experience with people who are not alive. How come with all you say and reveal, you're still alive? That's the weird question, but we have a lot of, tragedies and all those stuff.
Right, yeah.
So do you think you have some kind of protection?
And we've just had one, of course, in Malta with the journalist that was uncovering corruption in Malta, who was killed in a car explosion this very week. Well, it's not really a weird question. It's an understandable one, and it's one I've been asked many times. But it would take a long time to go deep into the nature of reality and how we interact with it. But again, part of it comes back to perception. People say, why don't you have a bodyguard? Well, if I have a bodyguard, that is an external expression of my perception that something could happen to me. And once you allow that into your perceptual frequency band, you can manifest that. If you will not allow it in, it cannot manifest. It cannot. Because, as I explain in the books and in the talks, and it's provable fact within mainstream science and even in quantum physics, the world that we are experiencing now, the world we call daily life, the physical world, only exists in the form that we think we're experiencing it and see it in a few centimeters at the back of the brain, which decodes visual reality. That's the only place it exists. There is no out there in terms of a physical world. It's in here. We're experiencing in here. This is being acknowledged more and more and more in mainstream science. This is where the world exists. And so, of course, if the world exists as we experience it in a few centimeters at the back of the brain, because that's what we decode from the equivalent of a Wi-Fi field into that holographic reality, which is what it is, not really physical, then we surely have control over what is manifested there and what we experience. Yes, it is. And if we start thinking and accepting that something can happen to us, we are opening that to manifestation. Doesn't mean it will, but it means you're opening up the possibility. When I was going around America speaking to nobody in the early 1990s and mid 1990s and late 1990s, more in America, more than mid to late 1990s, I would see people speaking at these various events, and they would say, I don't know how long I'm going to be allowed to keep saying this, because they're obviously going to kill me eventually, and words to that effect. And you'd go back a year or a couple of years later, and you say, what's happened to so-and-so? Oh, yeah, he was killed. And I remember sitting at some of those conferences, hearing these people say about, I don't know how long they're going to allow me to keep saying this. And I kept thinking, you want to be careful. You're not going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy here. And I've never allowed the perception to enter my perception of reality that anything could happen to me. But I do also think, and I have been told this many times over the years through various psychics and what have you, that there is some form of protection around me, and there's certainly a guiding force. I couldn't have uncovered all this information and written all these books, many of them big books full of enormous amounts of information. I couldn't have done that unless I'd lived a life in the last nearly 30 years of incredible synchronicity. It's been like walking through a maze, and some hidden force is opening doors and closing doors, so you find your way through the maze. If I'd have been left alone to my own resources alone, without this guiding force, I would never, ever have been able to uncover this, because it's been uncovered by incredible synchronicity, walking into people, books, experiences, etc., that have been perfect for what I was researching at that time. It's like some hidden forces handing you puzzle pieces for you to put together the puzzle, handing them to you almost in the order you need to most easily and quickly see the picture that's emerging. So there is a hidden force, and it's not just working through me, it's working through lots and lots of people. That is also a protection force as well. That means that you can say and do things and not have the consequences that others might think you might have. And interestingly, this new book that's coming out in November called Everything You Need to Know But Have Never Been Told is absolutely explosive. It's going to upset and make furious so many people that do not want this information out there. And it's going to, those that are the politically correct, tyrannical enforcers are going to have to take to their beds drinking sweet tea or something, because they're just not going to be able to handle what's in it. Because we've reached the point where we have to say here and no further. Don't tell me what I can and cannot say. Because if we keep going down that road as we are going down it, then eventually there's only one place it leads, and that's complete censorship of everything that is not in keeping with the official version of what the hidden hand and indeed the authorities that we can see want people to have access to. We're seeing it all the time: censorship, 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 censorship. And this book says here and no further. So it's going to be absolutely explosive. And I'm going to be very interested to see how it's received by these people, because it's what needs to be said, and said vigorously without fear of the consequences. Because once you think, oh, well, what are the consequences for me of saying this? What might happen to me? Well, the chances are you're not going to say it, and it needs to be said.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a lot of questions, but you said we have only an hour, so
yeah. Unfortunately, since I agreed to this interview, it's been the weather has changed here, and I live on an island, and I've got to get away to get to Slovakia. And the day that I was supposed to be leaving,
that's great.
The winds here are going to be so high that there's a very good chance the ferries won't be working. The ferries that I go on. So I've got to get off the island early before the winds, so that I'm not stuck here without a ferry. So
okay,
I have why I can only do an hour.
One really fast question. Are you happy?
Okay.
There's a question from our viewer. Are you happy?
Am I happy? Yeah. What? Yeah. Do we know what happiness is in this world? I think many people, or most people, judge their happiness by their level of unhappiness, because of the world that we live in and the way it's lived, and all the stress and all the pressures of conforming, the pressures to pay the rent and all the rest of it. I think when most of the time when people feel less unhappy, they take that to be happiness. But when I look at my life, there is nothing in the world, nothing that I would rather be doing than doing what I'm doing. And there's no one in the world I'd rather be than me doing it. So as happiness that goes, I mean, in the world that we live in, where so many people are doing every day what they really don't want to do, but they're doing it just to survive, then I find myself in a very privileged position to be doing what I do and loving what I do and not wanting to do anything else but what I do. So in that sense, yes, I would say I am happy. But do I have downtimes? Absolutely. But increasingly few and further apart.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, and good luck in Slovakia.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
It's great that you are going to our countries, to Czech Republic and Slovakia, because people need to hear those things. So we are very grateful to you that to your job, what you're doing, and thank you very much for this interview. And I will see you maybe some other time.
Okay, it's been a pleasure. I wish I could have stayed for longer, but
no, it's okay.
The weather has other ideas.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'll see you soon. Bye.
Okay. Bye.